Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island. Before we begin, Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early, and you'll get access to a monthly bonus episode. Be sure to use our personal link, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning. You can also find this one in the show notes to get a $20 discount on a yearly subscription. Now, back to Shutter Island. I always keep forgetting this is a Scorsese movie. I don't know why, but...
It's a little bit out of his regular wheelhouse, I think. It feels maybe more like something Fincher would have done, or... I don't know. There's definitely like a Scorsese flair to it, but yeah, it's not exactly his usual fare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how many times have you seen it? Like, what was your initial experience with it?
I think this is only the second time I've seen it. It might be the third. The first time I saw it was well over a decade ago, a long time ago, and I don't think I've watched it since then. My memory of it was pretty vague, and it's one that I watched, I think, before I had seen a lot of other Scorsese's material. I came at it kind of early, and before I was really into film that much, kind of early in my interest in film. And I remember what made me want to revisit it, besides the fact that it had been so long since I had seen it, was I had reviewed it on Letterboxd at one point a long time ago. Gave it like kind of a low rating. I don't remember what it was, but some people had commented and were like, please revisit this one, like rewatch this one. I think you might like it more. So I wanted to revisit it and kind of reevaluate it. But yeah, it's kind of Scorsese's, the closest thing to like Scorsese's shot at like a horror film. I think I forgot kind of how close to an actual horror film this is. I remembered it more as sort of like a thriller, mystery thriller with some twists, but it tips pretty heavily just kind of into that straight horror sort of category. Yeah, it was definitely fascinating to re-watch. It was really fun to watch it with my wife, who had never seen it, because I remembered kind of the twist, and I don't think I had seen it since the first time I watched it, so this was the first time watching it kind of knowing what was coming, and there's a lot that, I won't spoil anything yet, but there's a lot that sort of you reevaluate on the second watch. So it was fun watching that, and also getting to watch it unfold for someone else for the first time. I'm very interested to hear your take on this one. I don't remember why I disliked it the first time, but I have thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts about it, and it's like maybe some mixed feelings coming back to it. But yeah, that was my first, or that's the summary of where I stand, where I was coming from going into this, which is very messy and complicated. How was it for you?
Funnily enough, it's kind of the same. I think I also only seen it once around the time it came out. So that's 2010. That's well over a decade ago.
Yeah.
I remember being somewhat underwhelmed by it. And that was specifically because like a lot of my friends had already seen it. And they were like, oh, you got to see this movie. It's such a mind-blowing twist, and you'll never see it coming. And so then naturally you go into a movie like that, like, okay, what's the twist?
Yeah.
This is not to say like I was able to figure it out on the first go, but when you go into a movie like that, and it's obviously a mystery, it's obviously building to some kind of revelation. And so then when it happened, I thought like, okay, so this is the, you kind of expect a twist in a movie like this. So whenever people are kind of emphasizing or doubling down on that, I was expecting like a twist after the twist, or like I thought, oh, okay, so now this is going on, this is the revelation, but what's really going on, like I was still searching for, I was kind of not letting myself be hit with the weight of that twist, because I was anticipating something else, and then that obviously didn't came because this was the movie. There wasn't anything more to it.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, okay, I guess
Right.
that twist was interesting too, or unexpected too. And I think we can jump straight into spoilers with this one, right? It's most people have seen this at some point,
Yeah.
except for your wife, apparently.
And it's gonna be hard to, I think, kind of talk about without just like diving into what's going on. But I think there's an interesting little discussion to be had here about like that kind of twist dynamic in a movie. I don't think we've talked about one on the podcast, any movies on the podcast that really operate heavily in that format. It was kind of an interesting, I feel like there was a specific era in like the mid to like around, early 2010s, mid 2000s, where kind of twist movies were this big thing.
Yeah.
And I think they were very popular because people liked talking about them on the internet. Maybe that drove part of it, but also they're fun. But there's an interesting dynamic there where a lot of them can kind of end up being, I think, have what you're describing as being kind of underwhelming, especially if it's kind of this story that centers around a twist going in. A lot of times, how impactful a big, huge twist like this can be, it depends on sort of being blindsided by it. And so if you're just like looking the whole time waiting for it to happen, it takes some of the air out of that, which can mean two things. I think, like, one, it can hurt the experience for people who know the twist is coming, but also it can kind of make rewatching some of those movies a little bit weird. Sometimes rewatching it the second time is cool because you can look for the clues and you can see, why you can kind of catch the little, like that line indicates that. And I found that to be the case here. Stuff you pick up on where you're like, oh, I see the double meaning in that or whatever that points towards the reveal. But also it can kind of dramatically undercut the movie, because if the twist is kind of this important piece of the structure, if you know that's coming, I don't know. There's some movies that I think rely so heavily on that twist for the dramatic impact that knowing that kind of sucks the air out of rewatching them a little bit. And I'm not sure where I come down on this one. I think like it doesn't completely escape that dynamic. Like I think I was still even a little bit underwhelmed watching it a second time, but I did get something out of it. And I think there's still interesting stuff about the movie to discuss. Did you feel like you got stuff out of this movie dramatically the second time, even kind of knowing what was coming?
I feel like I know exactly what you're talking about, because that's something that I felt somewhat conflicted about, because you have this twist in this movie dramatically reframes, obviously, the whole story, like the whole context of the initial premise. And from here on, we're going to go
spoilers
because I don't want to dance around it anymore. So from this point, we know that Teddy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, is actually Andrew, who's actually been this patient. And so this whole mystery, like detective game, was basically like a literal game. Like it was a setup as part of his psychological treatment, I guess.
I guess.
Yeah. And like what I liked about revisiting this movie knowing the twist is that you pick up on all these little details. Like right in the opening, you can see the guards being like super suspicious at the start of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And knowing that the twist is, then like, oh, they're not being wary of the outside detective. They're being wary about having this very violent, like their most violent criminal set loose, and they have to act like it's you can kind of see Chuck, the Mark Ruffalo character, like he's struggling with his gun, like especially on second viewing, like you can tell he's never actually held one, or he doesn't know how to handle one. There's a lot of these little details. It's all but telling it straight to your face. I think, in fact, the sequence where Leo is confronting that guy he is later revealed to have beaten up, and that guy like straight on tells him like, this is for you, like this is it's all like a charade or something, which ties in nicely to an earlier line where they say like, oh, crazy people can say whatever they want and you'll never believe them. So I kind of like that they snuck it in, like the truth is kind of there in plain sight, and you dismiss it because it's being projected at you from this untrustworthy character.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I kind of liked it. And also I liked picking up more nuances in Leo's performance. Like there's something, especially knowing the twist, there's something compellingly pathetic about his portrayal of this detective. Like you can feel like he's sort of pretend playing. Or
Right.
he's,
Yes. Yeah.
and I feel like that's a very difficult task for him as an actor to kind of convey this character, but also do it with like 99% like conviction rate or like believability.
Yes. He also does a good job of like slowly, really slowly kind of transforming the performance. You can see the character kind of transform even before the reveal happens. Leo in the performance starts to bring out these elements where he feels more kind of crazed. I think the first time you watch it, if you don't know what the context is, you're like, oh, he's just becoming more desperate because they're trying to make him see, or he's being drugged or whatever. But you can also just feel his character kind of starting to fray before the reveal. And I think that transition is pulled off pretty well by Leo.
Mm-hmm. There's also some funny little deliberate continuity errors in this movie where I think the most glaring one is where Leo is interrogating this prisoner, the patient, Mrs. Kears, I think she was called, and she asks Mark Ruffalo's character Chuck to get like a glass of water, and then he brings it back, and you can see her drinking from the cup, but she has an empty hand. There's no glass in her hand, and that's because Leo is kind of projecting that away or blocking that out, and then there's a weird edit there where the glass is empty immediately, like there was no water in it to begin with. And that scene, by the way, also has some interesting framing going on where you can see every shot of a patient has like a guard in the background, and then the one with Chuck is clear, but then the one with Leo also has a guard in the background, suggesting that.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
So there's these little visual details that hint at the fact that Leo is also actually a patient there. So that's all the stuff I liked. It can really pick apart the game, and you can see the hints that they placed there and the way that Scorsese played around with it visually and with all these little details and these deliberate little mistakes. The downside for me, and I think that's what you were getting at, is that first experience of the movie, that initial mystery completely like shattered. And I feel like there's a regret in not being able to relive that particular experience. Like you know, like when the moment Leo steps on this island, like you already know he's not a detective. None of this matters. Like all this is make-believe.
Yeah.
And that makes the whole thing, it is a charade, but it also makes the dramatic story, or what made the story so dramatic at first, also kind of feel like a charade now.
Right.
And that, to me, that's the part that's undermined a little bit. None of that initial mystery feels as compelling anymore, because you know it's not just not what you think. It's like it's completely not what you thought it was. It's something else entirely. And I'm not sure if I like the movie, if I like that less, or if I just regret not being able to relive that again.
Right.
But that's a kind of natural consequence with any mystery movie, I guess, that has a twist like this, or even without a clear twist. Like you can only solve a puzzle once, and after that you know how it's done.
It's a dangerous game as like a critic, I think, to start playing the like, here's how you could fix this movie kind of like game. But I'm going to play it anyway because, you know, dangerous games are fun.
Yeah.
But like, I think I can imagine a way in which you could have had more depth available for a rewatch. Kind of what I wanted was if he was having some kind of conversations, and there's a tiny bit of this there, but it's not enough to really like dig your teeth into on a rewatch. But if he was having like conversations with, you know, suspects that he was interrogating, or when he's going and talking to this woman whose name I'm not remembering, who is kind of the stand-in for his wife, like she killed her children, Rachel, I think. You could have these conversations where the dialogue between Teddy and the other characters kind of takes on significance, not in terms of the plot twist necessarily or the literal details, but kind of how the character is grappling with the emotional fallout of the event and the repression and stuff like that. I think that's the big piece that's missing for me that would make this like a very compelling movie, at least for multiple watches. The most interesting stuff is kind of after the reveal, suddenly you're like, okay, now we get to dig into this character's trauma and what's really going on with him and how is he feeling about it and kind of this guilt that's destroying him and how he responds to that. But it doesn't feel like it really, unless I'm missing something, maybe there's examples you can think of, but it doesn't feel like it really examines that much before the reveal kind of comes about. You sort of have him playing with his guilt over his wife dying, and like there's the trauma about him in the war. So there's these suggestions that he's grappling with trauma as the Marshall character. It wasn't in a way where I felt like, okay, now going back over it, there's new information here that, you know, deepens my understanding of like how he was dealing with this trauma or responding to it. I think that's really what I would have wanted. That would have deepened kind of that rewatch. But this is the difficult part, is the movie is playing the part, quote unquote, of being a mystery movie for like it's fully committing to that bit for so long, which is part of why you really lets you buy into the character and the whole story. And then that makes the twist hit really hard. So it's possible that, you know, inserting more of that material early on would have undercut that and made it a little bit too, I don't know. I'm just kind of speculating as to maybe what feels like it's missing to me, because I think I feel the same way.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to pull off a twist like that, because it has to make sense on a first viewing, but then in the second one, as we talked about, it has to also make sense in this new context, knowing what the eventual revelation is going to be.
Yeah.
And I think that the movie did do a good job at setting up these red herrings, these like distractions that kind of distract you from what's really going on, while being close enough to the real thing that when the twist happens, it's not completely out of the blue. Like, I can imagine a version of this movie where Teddy was so convincing as a Marshall that the eventual twist would have been totally out of the left field. And a good twist has to be surprising, but it also has to make you go like, oh, I kind of felt that something, now it makes sense, you know. It has to not only like subvert your understanding of the movie, but it also has to make everything fall into place or into a full understanding of what's going on. And I think that's something that the movie did very well, in my opinion. It doesn't show maybe enough of what Leo's character is actually dealing with, but it does show a lot of the, like, close enough to be relatable, I guess, or to have it make sense in the end. Like, for example, the as you said, like the trauma of him killing his wife and mourning the death of his children is replaced as the Marshall version by him feeling trauma over killing maybe the SS guards and dealing with the death of the children he found in those camps. So there's the emotion there is similar enough to make the jump from one to the other after the twist has happened, while still having the roughly the same story beats. I'm not sure what you were talking about, if there was a way to bring that more close or bring that more strongly into the pre-twist story. I did notice this time, like at first you only see the first flashbacks you see that are the ones in Dachau, the concentration camp. So you can tell like that's initially set up. Oh, this is the Marshall and this is his trauma. Like he has been to war, he saw the concentration camps, and that's what he's struggling with now. But I noticed this time around, like the first reveal of the flashback of what actually happened, like the image of the three children, which is distinctively not the image from the camp, it's I think around the 1 hour mark, so, or at least before the midpoint of the movie, so well before the actual twist happens. So there is I think an early enough seed that's planted there that kind of instills that sense of doubt, like, oh, maybe there's more going on here than just the war trauma. But interestingly enough, that also comes with its own red herring, where then Teddy reveals that he's actually searching for himself. Ladus, I think he was called.
Yeah.
When he is Teddy, he refers to Ladus as being the arson that set his apartment
Right.
on fire, or set the apartment building on fire that also killed his wife. So you get a sense that there's more trauma going on, but then it also gives you a temporary motivation for, oh, maybe that's related to that, even though it won't be until the end, until you know the full context of it. So that it is, I think, more intricate than a lot of twist movies. It is, once the twist happens, it leaves very little room to grapple with the full implications of it. And that's maybe something that could have been expanded on a little bit, even though the movie already is like 2 hours and 20 minutes or something. 2 hours.
Yeah. I think some of what you're pointing to is an example of, I guess, kind of what I'm asking for, where there's, I'm thinking of that specific, there's one specific conversation that he has with Chuck about Ladus and kind of why he doesn't want to kill him, or kind of how he doesn't feel sort of anger towards Ladus. And that's kind of an interesting avenue to explore, where, considering the fact that he's actually talking about himself, you know, there's some interesting material there. It does a good job of pointing you towards where the twist is going, but like, I guess what I wanted there to be more emotional continuity for kind of Teddy interrogating his own guilt prior to that. Again, that's kind of hinted at in several places, but it never feels like his character, to me, it never feels like his character is actually really digging into that guilt emotionally, which I think what it might have been compelling to explore. But I want to say I don't want to just critique it. I jumped towards sort of the critique, but there is a lot of stuff that I think it is doing effectively. You mentioned a bunch of stuff already, and one of the things that I really like is kind of the storm and how that's used in the very oppressive environment of the storm. And there's this suggestion kind of towards the end. The timeline of the movie is very hard to get a grip on. It takes place over a couple of days, it feels like, but it's a little bit like The Lighthouse, where you're not exactly sure how much the passage of time is kind of this subjective experience that the characters are having and what's real. But then the very final scenes, the grounds are kind of improbably like sunny and cleaned up compared to the kind of wreckage of the aftermath of the storm. It felt to me like there was a suggestion there that maybe, at least to some extent, the kind of the storm that's happening is this more subjective event, part of Teddy's kind of hallucination and a subjective experience. I don't know if you felt that way as well.
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure if the storm actually happened, because Ben Kingsley character, he also mentions that when he's revealing to Teddy that it's always the same story, he specifically mention, there's the storm and then this and then that. And so it does suggest that in his mind, there's always this big storm. Otherwise, it would be pretty convenient that this test or this experiment would take place right at the moment that there's going to be a significant hurricane coming over the island. But yeah, then again, a lot of I'm not sure how that holds up on. I didn't rewatch this movie specifically looking out for, what if the storm isn't real? Like, does it still fit in? Because a lot of the actions that the characters take, not just Teddy, but also those around them, seem to be in response to or based on this storm being a real thing. Like the change of clothes, everybody being wet, the whole thing with the chopping the fallen branches and stuff. And I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the suggestion there, if that is the case, is that you kind of have this revelation as you go along that there are these moments that were pure hallucination. You kind of realize, Chuck falling to his death, like a lot of these things were pure hallucination.
The Rachel in the cave,
Yeah, the cave, the rats, there's a bunch of stuff. And obviously the kind of visions he's having, those are the most obvious things. Those are kind of framed as dreams too. But beyond that, we're solidly within his subjective experience. Like, I don't think the first scene on the boat where they're riding in, I don't know that maybe they took him out on the ferry and brought him back in as a part of the role play.
Yeah.
It's possible.
I can imagine they just did like a little loop.
Right.
Or had them be both on the boat until like Chuck was like, okay, he seems into it now, and that's when we have back.
Yeah. But how much of that was just in Teddy's imagination as well? I think one of the things I like about the movie is that it doesn't sit you down at the end and go, oh, the storm was fake, blah, blah, blah. It manages to avoid, besides the little scene in the lighthouse where they're kind of directly talking to Teddy and kind of telling him, hey, you don't believe this. There is a little bit of that, like, okay, now we're going to tell you exactly what is really going on. But it manages to sidestep feeling like they're speaking to the viewer in that moment where there's like they're like expositing directly to you. It feels like they're actually saying that for Teddy's benefit. And there are a lot of details that they leave kind of in question, and they never sit down and like, okay, now we're going to explain every element, which I do really like. I like that it kind of stays as this mystery, this subjective experience that you only ever really see mostly from the inside, except for a little bit at the end where you perhaps see a more objective view of reality. But I think like the majority of the movie is really framed kind of explicitly within Teddy / Andrew's like subjective experience, which I think is cool. It does well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think also with the storm, it doesn't really matter that much if it was real or not, because I think either way, it still functions as this metaphor for Teddy's inner landscape and the kind of the storm that's raging within his own psyche. I like what you say about the whole movie basically being Teddy's subjective point of view, because even then the little mistakes sort of make sense, where you have the woman drinking a cup that's not there, or just drinking from an empty hand. Is like this. At first I thought like, oh, maybe there's a few hints at like the objective reality, or showing the what's really going on and what Teddy is perceiving. But I guess the little mistake then is Teddy's subjective because he blocks it out. But at the same time, that's also it's communicating to us that something is off, like that this is not the complete objective view of reality, even though you only see it in like you might catch it in your peripheral vision. And maybe it suggests that because this movie is so in the subjective mind of Teddy, is that it suggests that he might have got that little moment too, if he even like in his own peripheral vision, and that in turn kind of suggests that there is a gateway into his more. That's the whole thing that these doctors are looking for. They're trying to reach beneath the illusion or the delusion and find the real Andrew in there. And that, I feel like those little mistakes, those little moments where you can poke holes into this version of reality, demonstrate that this is a potential pathway for Leo's character, that he is able to at least, like, even if he's caught up in the delusion, he is able to see like the rough edges around it, and which ultimately might help convince him at the end, or help him to let himself be convinced that this is not the real world as it is, but his own.
There's a moment, I'm not going to be able to remember exactly how it unfolds, but he walks in and he first kind of sees who he believes is the German psychiatrist kind of sitting in the chair in that one room. They talk to each other. The psychiatrist is talking about defense mechanisms and keeps pointing out kind of Teddy's defense mechanisms. And then there's a moment later, he has a conversation. It's before I believe it's before the reveal to Teddy anyway, but he's kind of, they're talking about patients, kind of the way psychiatrists will interact with patients, and they have a conversation again about defense mechanisms. And there's kind of this awareness that Teddy has that, they might call certain, he says something about like seeing survival instincts as defense mechanisms. Like a psychiatrist might see survival instincts as defense mechanisms when dealing with a patient.
That's the conversation in the cave, right?
Oh, yes. You're right.
The quote-unquote real Rachel, who turns out to be a hallucination, but she tells Teddy about her being this acclaimed or respected psychiatrist who was essentially framed, so she says, by the institution on Shutter Island, and that she kind of explains how psychiatrists can manipulate people into being perceived as insane or deranged or whatever, and that whenever that label sticks, then everything that patient does or that person does becomes an expression of that insanity, instead of, as you said, like a natural fear becomes paranoia, or healthy self-defensive mechanism becomes this denial of reality or this escapist behavior or something along those lines. And I think the movie did touch on some very real issues there with how we deal with mental issues or that sort of stuff. But I feel like that's a conversation that would have been more interesting if Leo's character actually wasn't a patient, if he really was just maybe like a disgruntled marshal that was coming to this island on this personal vendetta, and then eventually got corrupted or broken down to a point where he would become admitted as a patient. But that would just have been a completely different movie then.
Yeah.
This episode was brought to you by Mubi, the curated streaming service showing hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe, which both Thomas and I have been big fans of for many years.
There's a few films I want to recommend real quick. One is specifically for Tom. I started watching it the other day, and it's called America as Seen by a Frenchman. And Tom and I sometimes have discussions about our different perspectives on American culture. And this is a really interesting documentary that kind of shows a lot of footage from America in the 60s, but presents it in this very sort of obviously from the perspective of a foreigner. It's a fascinating documentary, and I think Tom might be interested in it. And if you're listening to this...
That does sound interesting.
And that sounds interesting to you, you might be interested as well. There's another documentary on Mubi right now in the US that I really enjoy called The Wolf Pack that I definitely recommend people check out. And if documentaries aren't your speed, they recently added Bong Joon-ho's The Host, which is great and worth a watch.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
There's way more than that. That just barely scratches the surface. So check one of those out, or just explore the library. It's a great way to find really cool, interesting stuff to watch.
Yeah, you can get a 30-day extended free trial when you go to mubi.com/cinemaofmeaning, or just follow the link in the show notes.
Thanks again to Mubi for sponsoring this episode. I guess maybe this would be an interesting place to kind of pivot into discussing some of that, because I think this movie is most effective as sort of a horror film, a scary experience. There's a lot of imagery in it that's kind of unsettling and horrifying. That second big dream sequence where it's like, the child coming alive in Dark Out is very unsettling. And a lot of that is really well framed. And I think kind of the narrative of, maybe I'm actually crazy and paranoia, all those things are interesting territory to explore within a horror film. And it functions well kind of as a horror film. But I think the structure of the movie and kind of where it's going, and the reveal that Teddy is just sort of this delusional guy who killed his wife, I don't think this movie really has anything that meaningful to say about mental illness. Like, it maybe works. If anything, it has interesting things to say about like kind of our own repression of guilt and how we deal with trauma and guilt metaphorically. But I think like if you're taking it, you can't really take it on any kind of literal level in how it's engaging
Yeah.
with like trauma or mental illness, because I think it's just too out there and like wild and not based enough in how those things actually work, at least based on my understanding of them, to really be like commenting that meaningfully about them. But I think maybe there's still interesting material there if we're looking at that as a metaphor for kind of just how people in general deal with trauma or guilt or these kinds of things. I don't know. What do you have any thoughts about that? If it has anything actually to say about mental illness?
When you look at Teddy's character, I don't think there's a portrait of a real mental disorder there that holds up to psychological scrutiny,
Right.
like at
Yeah.
least not as far as I know. I think the more interesting question regarding mental illness here is probably with regards to Teddy's or Andrew's wife and the way she did the harm that she did because of her illness being neglected in part by Teddy. And that's also part of his guilt that he did not
Yeah.
recognize what she was going through and didn't want to get the help that she needed. And that's what eventually led to this whole tragedy. I noticed it more this time, but there's also a more larger conflict going on, but it's more in the background about these different schools of psychology, with the one wanting to basically lobotomize everyone, or the camp A that's more about intervention, surgical intervention. The other group that's more about medicating, and then there's the one that seems to be represented by Ben Kingsley's character, who believes that if you just, meet the patient on their terms, you can find a way to connect with them and reach them through those means.
Right.
That's a discussion or a conflict that really is pushed to the background a lot in this movie, and there's not, and also one that feels outdated by modern standards. Like, I feel like the conflict about mental illness and psychology or psychological intervention as it is presented here is not the one that's as relevant today.
Right.
Like, because, this feels like a very outdated version of how we used to look at insanity and that sort of stuff. Stuff that we've already long moved on from. So in that sense, I'm not sure to what extent it's still relevant. I'm also not that familiar with the modern field of psychology and the way the kind of obstacles that we are dealing with now in how we view and treat mental illnesses. I feel like generally there's much more awareness now, and especially like the whole concept of lobotomies. That's
Right. That's
as far as I know,
time.
that's completely out of the window, right? Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. At least,
Yeah.
at least in most first world countries that I'm aware of.
So yeah, when it comes to mental illnesses, I kind of struggle to make that feel very meaningful. I think it did so on the when I first saw the movie, and when I saw it again. For me, the more interesting question is the one that Teddy poses at the end, which is more of a question of personal morality, I guess, or personal freedom.
Yeah.
When he expresses, like, is it he essentially, like, I feel like what the text of the movie suggests is that although it seems like he's giving him, or that he's relapsed into his fantasy world, there's this little hint when he says to, or when he proposes the question to Chuck or his doctor, that he asks, like, is it better to live as a monster or to die as a good person? And I feel like you can also see it in Chuck's reaction. He's kind of taken aback by it. And so there's a little hint there that maybe Teddy is willingly giving himself up, willingly letting himself be lobotomized and be turned into a zombie, because he knows that then that way he won't do any further harm. So that's basically him making a conscious choice as a sane person, or like he's making a moral choice to take himself out of the equation that way. And that, I think that also feels more to Scorsese's typical thematic issues.
Yes. Yeah.
In some weird way, it reminded me of Silence. Not to go in too deep into spoilers on that movie, but that movie deals with the question of faith and being forced to apostatize. Is that the right word?
Yes. Yeah.
And that also ends with the question, am I going to stick with my beliefs, or am I going to stick with my beliefs on a personal level, like in the own intimacy of my own private mind, so to say, or am I going to project them outwards in some performative way and then face the consequences of that? And then with both of those, like, what are the implications for that for the wider system around it? Like, one thing I didn't think of initially with Shutter Island is that at the end, like, I thought it was kind of inspiring in the sense like, oh, he did in fact reclaim his sanity and then makes the moral choice or the personal choice to sacrifice himself, so to say.
Right.
But that also, I didn't think of the implications of that for this broader conflict that's kind of in the background, because it also implies that now the team Ben Kingsley has essentially lost and the team Lobotomy has won. And so there is this sense that the world is still kind of corrupted or crooked, whereas, and that the important thing was that Teddy safeguarded something of his own humanity on that individual scale. And I guess that's also what happens somewhat at the end of Silence. That is it more important to preserve something on like that small individual personal scale, or is it better to perform something outward for the system, even if that means crossing like a personal line or transgressing in some other way?
Yeah. And that would fit neatly into kind of the a tourist reading I have of Scorsese's kind of filmography as a whole and the themes that he likes to explore, has been exploring through a lot of his films, of kind of his own grappling with his Catholic faith and this tension between kind of like, I think on some level, like believing part of it or wanting to engage with it, but also like being disconnected from it. You can see him exploring a lot of that territory, sometimes very explicitly, like in Silence, throughout his filmography, but often he's exploring, ideas that are adjacent to that. And so, yeah, I think you're onto something there. There's also just like there's an interesting little maneuver there where it's kind of like, it feels like he's kind of accepting his guilt, but then that means he also wants to accept this kind of like punishment for that almost. But in order to do that, he has to, like, he doesn't want the system to let him off the hook. And if he just accepted his sanity, then maybe that would happen. So in order to get kind of the judgment that he thinks he deserves, he has to kind of work around the system.
It does become more complicated when you take that layer into account.
Right. Yeah. Either way, I mean, whether or not that's thematically what like Scorsese is trying to get at, I see that very end bit in the way you're talking about, where I read it as he is sane, and for whatever reason, we don't get to completely understand, but for whatever reason, Andrew Laeddis, Teddy, is choosing to be lobotomized. He's kind of faking the relapse, so to speak, in order to be lobotomized. But it is, it's ambiguous a little bit, so we can't really know for sure.
Yeah. I feel like for me, it's always been clear enough to see that as the definitive interpretation of that scene.
Right.
It also makes it just way more
interesting.
That's the way that opens up all those complexities that wouldn't be there if he just relapsed and have that be the end of it. That would mean that we've just went on this journey of Teddy reclaiming his autonomy, and then at the end it's just like hard cut to the next scene, to the final scene, and it's gone again.
Yeah.
I think maybe that was a element in his choice, that he figured, okay, I have now this moment of clarity. I'm not sure how long it's gonna last, so I'm gonna use, like, assuming I'm gonna slip back into my illness or my affliction, I'm gonna use this little brief moment of autonomy that I have to make this decision without necessarily thinking of those wider consequences.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like I feel like if he felt like, oh, I might be slipping away anyways, and that would have also meant a failure on that systemic level, then at least like now I can preserve this little bit and make life a little bit easier for those on the rest of the island, because apparently he was one of the worst prisoners they had, who was constantly terrorizing the others and being kind of violent about his delusions.
Yeah. At first, I was wondering if it was a thing where, like, he woke up, he returns to his sanity, he remembers what happened, and he is kind of like, I can't live with this guilt, I can't live with this, so he allows himself to be lobotomized. But I don't know that the lobotomy actually would remove those memories, so I don't know if that makes sense kind of as a motivation for his decision, because I don't know. I don't know about enough. It doesn't imply enough about what the lobotomy is really going to do to him to know if that's part of his motivation as well, where he's just like, I can't.
I think it's suggested that he basically becomes a zombie, that he's
Right, but does that
completely
mean
detached from,
so like it's possible that part of his motivation could be like, I just don't want to live with this reality of knowing what happened, but instead of unconsciously repressing it by slipping back into a delusion, he's consciously choosing to allow it to be repressed by opting for this lobotomy, which will kind of put him into a similar place of just like not having to actually face up to sort of the reality of what happened. Like the suggestion is kind of like he can't live with that regardless of whether he's sane or just on some level has to break, he just can't live with it. It's either delusion or lobotomy. Like he doesn't see it as an option to like be conscious and like live with the weight of the guilt or the pain of what happened.
Yeah, I think the two can go hand in hand.
Right.
Like the reality of his life is that he does see himself as a monster. Like that's I think the main driving force beneath his guilt and his regret and trauma and his grief. And so I think in that sense he may have just wanted to opt out of the pain of having to bear that reality, but I think it's also because that reality implies that he is a monster. He wants to kind of take himself out of the equation in that way too. So I think he just saw there were all around benefits to
he's
not being
not being around,
not being that the way he spent the last 2 years. Yeah,
I don't know a whole lot about, and I haven't read up on interpretations if other people feel this way. I don't know a whole lot about sort of kind of like the Catholic view of purgatory. But this movie also has a very sort of purgatorial, like somebody stuck in this kind of hellscape that they have to come to some sort of recognition of their own guilt in order to sort of pass from there into somewhere else. I feel like that idea has some kind of vague influence here, even if it's not kind of explicitly operating as kind of a metaphor for purgatory or something like that.
The landscape does sort of have this otherworldly feel to it.
And they're on this island.
I don't think it's based on I don't think this is a real island, right? I think it's mostly constructed with some of the CGI didn't hold up too well, but like I got the sense like there's a lot of the compositions where you saw the landscapes in the background were all touched up or like composited from multiple. It wasn't shot on location. That's what I'm trying, or at least like not on the location as we eventually see it.
Right.
But I think that's an interesting angle. Yeah, not sure what then the ending means.
Right. If that's the case.
It's not exactly an ascension to heaven or a descent into hell, but
it almost feels like if he is like if he's supposed to be in purgatory in the movie, I think that's the main thing that keeps me from thinking that that's mainly how this movie is functioning. Because if he's in that place, it feels like he's just stuck in it by the end. It's not a definitive enough, like, okay, now you've accepted your guilt, and now you get to like, you're cleansed and you get to go to heaven or something. He just kind of stays in the purgatory.
I always have like some issues with that allegory because I feel like it can be applied to so many movies because it's just such a archetypal framework where you can like symbolically apply it to a lot of movies without it being a deliberate or like distinct allegorical construct. Like for example, like another Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Revenant, to me that did feel like a sort of purgatory-ish movie. I made a video about that one because that's also very, very light spoilers for The Revenant, but there's this harrowing, dreamlike journey through nature, essentially, or like I think in my interpretation, I called it like America's purgatory. You know, you have these roaming bison that are now all but extinct, or not anymore, but at the time, they were at some point in American history, they were like hunted to the point of extinction. And there's that moment at the very end where he kind of breaks the fourth wall as a hint that he's now, like, that's his liberation from that movie. But I don't know. It's just to say, like, it's a very classical and interesting framework. I think because it just sets the stakes so clearly for a conflict and a resolution, and one that feels so, I was going to say primal almost, but so basic, so foundational that it's hard. It's almost hard not to project something like that on it, especially on a Scorsese movie who, as you said, often deals with Catholic and spiritual themes, and often has like spiritual subtext even to his very, very non-religious movies like Goodfellas or Wolf of Wall Street. Or
Speaking of which, do you make anything specific out of the warden kind of coming out of the woodwork and just being like, God is a violent God. God loves violence. There's this whole very interesting dialogue that I can't figure out how to frame within the rest of the movie.
I think he's the pro lobotomy guy, right? He basically wants to lobotomize Leo, and with the argument like, you think you're violent? Well, my violence is going to trump yours, and that's going to be the end of you. That's how I'm going to win. That's how we restore like God's order on this planet, by just having the one violence be greater than the other, and so that way it supposedly balances everything out. I'm not sure.
It's interesting if you think about that in combination with kind of the exploration of Leo being, or Ted, not Leo, but his character, the Marshal, being traumatized by the sort of retributive violence against the guards at the death camp, and him feeling like that was murder. So he's kind of grappling with that as being wrong. They sort of have this instinct. They see all the death camp, and then they respond to it by just killing the guards. But then later he looks back on that and he goes, that was wrong, that was murder, and he feels kind of guilt about that. But there's that impulse of like, let's kill these guards, they did this horrible thing, is very much this sort of like violence as retributive justice that the warden is kind of representing. So there's definitely like, that is a thread that's running through the movie, but I can't really figure out exactly how that ties into kind of the theme as a whole, except for the fact of like him making the choice at the very end, like, okay, I'm going to accept this violence as maybe some sort of like punishment for what I've done. I guess he also like kills his wife kind of for that same reason, to kind of retaliate against her for killing the children. By the end, he's accepting that kind of for himself, which seems, I don't know, that seems antithetical to the ethos that the movie is kind of like putting forward through the doctor, and this more like kind of understanding, gracious approach to kind of trying to heal people and get them to a state of like, okay, we can overcome this wrong and restore your sanity, versus just this cycle of, we're just going to go back and forth killing each other.
I don't remember that conversation exactly. I think Leo counters with the idea that even though God gave us the capacity for violence, he also gave us the capacity for moral reasoning and freedom of choice, which obviously becomes pivotal towards the end, where he's not reacting out of a reflexive illness or affliction that he has in his psyche, but he's acting now out of God's given freedom, so to say. And that would also, I guess, denounce the warden's perception of violence, where, with Leo against the guards or against his wife, it's all like, I see a monster, I kill a monster, and there's no deliberation going on or no consideration of morality. And I'm not sure if that was the other psychiatrist who said who he had a different confrontation with the German psychiatrist, where I think he was the one who said, like, oh, whenever I see a monster, I act, or something like that. And that's when Leo sort of does the same, and he tranquilizes him.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly, but it does feel like for me, at least the setup here is that Scorsese is showing that the lobotomy side of the arguments, to put it like this, is the more inconsiderate one, because it's not grounded within that moral deliberation. It's just reflexiveness, like, oh, we see this insane person that we don't want to deal with, let's chop a part of his brain off, or something like that. That's my take on it, at least.
Well, I think it's an interesting layered movie. There's a lot of, obviously we got into some interesting discussion surrounding specific details here. The end, I think, does an interesting thing of that. I mean, by the end, I mean the very end. I think that kind of final scene twist, not really a twist, but that final scene moment is the most interesting sort of aspect of the movie in terms of kind of posing this final moral question, and maybe I've come around. I think this conversation in some way has made me, as we've talked about it, has made me come around a little bit, and thinking that there might be a little bit more depth here than I assumed, at least last night when I was rewatching it, or feeling. But it's still, I think, pretty messy and like mostly interesting as kind of this sounding board and thing to discuss. And as in this original experience with this kind of cool twist, than it is as this narrative that I can engage with, that kind of speaks to me on some kind of deeper level intuitively. I think that's kind of where I'm landing on this. Yeah, maybe we'll have to explore. I think Scorsese, it's interesting that this is the first Scorsese we're coming to, because I think there's some others that deal with maybe similar ideas in a much more fleshed out and like meaningful way. So we might have to, I think this is a very entertaining movie, but I think there's some others by him that kind of engage with the same thematic ideas in a little bit more nuanced and deep way. So maybe we'll have to visit one of those in the future and see what we can find there.
Yeah, for me, that's why I said at the beginning, like, I keep forgetting this is a Scorsese movie. It doesn't feel like his traditional, like, when I think of Scorsese, I think of like the extremes. On the one hand, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street, the Life of Sin, and on the other side, there's Last Temptation of Christ, Kundun, Silence. Now, the other side, the virtue, the distinctive search for morality and spirituality. And yeah, Shadow Island, it kind of fits oddly in on that spectrum, I think. I always remembered it as a fun experience, as one that definitely is thought-provoking and fun to analyze and kind of fun to pick apart. Maybe not as compelling to rewatch over and over and over again as you would a movie that is more morally dense, or at least not in its implications towards the end, but in the entire experience. That's just a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more consistent, I guess.
Yeah,
but overall, I think it's an interesting insight into Scorsese in the way he would handle a different genre. And we should definitely talk about more, because Scorsese definitely is one of my favorites, and we should talk about him more often.
Yes. Yeah, we're just scratching the surface here. We'll get into some of the good ones, I'm sure, at some point in the future. So, but I'm glad I'm glad we talked about this one, because this is one that I wanted to revisit for sure. So, I think it was fun to do that and fun to chat about that here. So, yeah, I guess tell us your suggestions for which Scorsese we should dig into, because there's a lot of them that we could. And we won't have time for all of them, probably. So, definitely. Unless we do this podcast for a decade.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. We've covered Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, and many, many others. So you're basically getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes, and we'll see you again next time.